The entire story of the Anunnaki, boring history for sleep. Before names were written down, before stories were organized into chapters, and before history was something people studied, life moved at a very slow pace. Days were marked not by clocks, but by light. Morning arrived, evening followed, night returned again. People lived close to the land. They woke when the sun rose, rested when it disappeared, and repeated this pattern without much variation. In the wide, flat region between two rivers, people learned to farm. These rivers were later called the Tigris and the Euphrates. The land that was fertile but unreliable. Some years it flooded gently. Other years it flooded too much. Sometimes it did not flood at all. There was no clear explanation for this. Without science, people searched for patterns. They watched the sky. They watched the movement of stars. They noticed that seasons repeated, but not perfectly. This uncertainty was uncomfortable, but also familiar. To explain it, people began to tell stories, not stories for excitement, but stories for order. They wanted reasons. Why did floods come? Why did crops fail? Why did kings rule? These stories slowly became belief systems. Within those belief systems appeared names, and among those names were the Anunnaki. At first, they were not a group. They were simply mentioned. A name here, a role there. There was no single creation story. There was no unified mythology. Different cities told slightly different versions, each shaped by local needs and local traditions. This was normal. Life was repetitive, and so were the stories. The Anunnaki existed in this quiet repetition. They were part of the background of daily life. They were not heroes. They were not villains. They were explanations. As people settled into cities, they built temples, not to impress, but to maintain balance. These structures were practical. Offerings were given regularly, not emotionally. The goal was stability. And so, long before anyone would argue about what the Anunnaki truly were, they already had a role, a small one, a calm one, and that is where everything begins. The word Anunnaki did not appear suddenly. It developed slowly as language itself developed. Ancient Sumerian was not designed for storytelling. It was designed for record-keeping. People used it to list grain, land, animals, and labor. When religious ideas were written down, they followed the same careful, practical style. The word Anunnaki is formed from parts. Each part had meaning. Anu referred to the sky. It was not the sky as a place, but the sky as a concept, distant, above, and unreachable. Na suggested lineage or connection. Ki referred to earth. Together, the word described beings connected to both sky and earth, not travelers, not visitors, simply higher-order figures within a belief system. Anu himself was not dramatic. He rarely acted. He existed more as an authority than a character. Because of this, the Anunnaki were not rebellious or independent. They followed order. They were not all-powerful. They had specific roles. Some were associated with water, others with fertility, others with law. Their authority came from association, not action. There was no fixed number of Anunnaki. Some texts mention 7. Others mention many more. This inconsistency was not a problem. The ancient world did not require consistency. Names changed. Roles shifted. What mattered was function. The Anunnaki existed to explain structure, why authority existed, why nature behaved as it did, and why society had rules. They were not meant to be imagined in detail. There were no clear physical descriptions, no height, no color, no specific forms. This lack of detail was intentional. The Anunnaki were ideas, not characters. And in that quiet, undefined space, their meaning remained simple. They were not mysterious. They were necessary. And that was enough. In everyday life, the Anunnaki were not discussed often. Most people were busy. They worked in fields. They tended animals. They carried water. They repaired walls. Religion was not a separate activity. It was part of routine. When crops grew well, it was acceptable. When crops failed, it was unfortunate. In both cases, the Anunnaki were assumed to be involved. There was no strong emotional response. Temples stood at the center of cities, not as places of excitement, but as places of order. Inside them, priests performed tasks that were repetitive and careful. They washed statues. They prepared food offerings. They recited the same phrases again and again. These actions were not meant to impress the gods. They were meant to maintain balance. The Anunnaki were believed to have assigned roles to everyone. Kings ruled because they were allowed to. Farmers farmed because that was their place. Laborers worked because work was necessary. This structure was accepted. Clay tablets recorded decisions and rituals. The writing was small. The language was formal. There were no dramatic speeches. Most references to the Anunnaki appeared alongside lists of supplies, building plans, or legal matters. Religion and administration were the same thing. People did not expect personal messages from the Anunnaki. They did not expect visions or signs. If something went wrong, it was assumed that balance had shifted slightly. The solution was simple: more offerings, more care, more repetition. Over time, these practices became habits. Children learned them by watching adults. Adults followed them without questioning. The Anunnaki existed quietly within the system. They did not interrupt daily life. They explained it, and because of that, they were rarely noticed at all. Time passed in a way that felt gradual to the people living it. There were no clear endings between one era and the next. There were only small changes. Cities grew larger. Some were abandoned. New ones appeared nearby. Languages shifted slightly. Names were pronounced differently. As this happened, beliefs adjusted without much discussion. The Anunnaki did not disappear. They were absorbed. When the Akkadians rose to power, they adopted many Sumerian ideas. They translated names. They simplified roles. Some Anunnaki merged with other gods. Some lost importance. This process continued under Babylonian rule. The stories became more structured, but also more restrained. The Anunnaki were no longer primarily sky-associated figures. They became administrators of fate. They were said to sit in assembly. They listened. They decided. There was no emotion described in these decisions. Judgment was not punishment. It was classification. Later texts placed many of the Anunnaki in the underworld. This was not a place of fire or suffering. It was quiet, a shadow continuation of existence. The Anunnaki oversaw this space the way officials oversee records. They maintained order among the dead. They did not interact much with the living. Their role became more distant. As centuries continued, individual gods like Marduk or Ishtar gained prominence, while the Anunnaki faded into collective mention. They became a background group, still present, still named, but no longer central. By this point, the Anunnaki were less about explanation and more about tradition. They remained because they'd always been there. And so they continued, unchanged in function, slowly changing in form, quietly passing through history without urgency or drama. Many centuries later, long after the people who believed in the Anunnaki were gone, their writings remained buried. They were not preserved intentionally. They were simply forgotten. Cities collapsed. Buildings fell inward. Dust and soil slowly covered what remained. Clay tablets survived because clay, once baked, lasts a long time. When these tablets were eventually uncovered, they were not found neatly arranged. They were broken, scattered, often incomplete. Some tablets contained prayers. Others contained lists of offerings. Many were administrative records with only brief religious references. The Anunnaki appeared in these texts casually. Their names were not emphasized. They were not explained. The writers assumed the reader already understood who they were. This created a problem much later. Modern readers did not share that background. When scholars began translating the tablets, they worked slowly and cautiously. Languages had to be reconstructed. Symbols had multiple meanings. Context was often missing. Because of this, translations were sometimes uncertain. A single word could be read in different ways. Over time, some non-academic interpretations appeared. These interpretations combined unrelated texts. They treated metaphor as literal description. They filled gaps with assumption. This was not how the original texts were written. Ancient writers did not intend to create a single, unified narrative. They were recording routine belief, not telling a story with beginning and an end. The Anunnaki were mentioned because they were familiar, not because they were special. When fragments are removed from context, they can appear mysterious. But in their original setting, they were ordinary. They were part of a belief system that functioned quietly and predictably. The misunderstandings came later, not from the ancient world itself, but from distance. Time created silence. Silence invited interpretation, and interpretation slowly replaced simplicity. This shift did not change what the Anunnaki were to the people who first named them. It only changed how they were seen afterward. In the modern world, ancient material often feels incomplete. People expect stories to have clear beginnings, middles, and endings. They expect characters to act with intention and emotion. The ancient texts did not do this. When the Anunnaki were rediscovered through translation, they did not arrive as a finished narrative. They appeared as names, titles, and brief mentions. For many readers, this felt unsatisfying. Silence invites imagination. During the 20th century, writers outside academic traditions began offering new explanations. They reassembled fragments into complete stories. They added motivation. They added purpose. They added technology. In these modern versions, the Anunnaki were no longer symbolic figures. They became planners, engineers, visitors. This transformation was gradual. Each retelling added a small amount of detail. Over time, these details felt established, even though they were not present in the original sources. The ancient words were translated again, this time into modern expectations. Metaphors became machines. Poetry became instruction. The Anunnaki were no longer distant gods. They were active and intentional. This shift reflected modern interests more than ancient belief. Technology, space travel, and origins became common themes. The Anunnaki were adapted to fit these ideas. Their names remained, but their meaning changed. This process did not require deception. It required only curiosity and repetition. Once an idea is repeated often enough, it becomes familiar, and familiarity can feel like truth. The original tablets, however, remained unchanged. They continued to say very little. The modern reinvention existed alongside the ancient silence. One was imaginative, the other was quiet. Both were human responses to uncertainty. Only one belonged to the past. Even when belief systems fade, names often remain. They persist quietly, without requiring agreement or understanding. The Anunnaki remained because they were recorded. Clay tablets were copied. Later, they were studied. Then they were discussed. Each step kept the name in circulation. Human attention naturally returns to what feels unresolved. The Anunnaki were never fully defined. They did not have a single story. They did not have a final ending. This openness allowed them to move easily from one interpretation to another. Cultures change, but curiosity remains. Modern readers encounter ancient ideas through fragments. Fragments encourage reflection. The Anunnaki became a place where questions could rest. Questions about origins. Questions about authority. Questions about why things are structured the way they are. These questions do not require answers to remain interesting. They only require space. The Anunnaki provided that space. They existed at the edge of explanation, not proven, not disproven, simply present. They also benefit from distance. Time softens context. Without the daily routines that once surrounded them, the Anunnaki feel detached from their original purpose. This detachment makes them flexible. They can become symbols, metaphors, or stories, depending on the listener. Memory does not preserve accuracy. It preserves usefulness. The Anunnaki are useful because they are quiet enough to accept many meanings. They do not insist on one truth. They wait, and in waiting they continue. Every belief system eventually settles into stillness, not through argument, but through time. The Anunnaki did not vanish suddenly. They were not replaced in a single moment. They simply became less necessary. As understanding of the natural world grew, explanations changed. Floods could be measured. Seasons could be predicted. Authority could be questioned. The roles once filled by the Anunnaki slowly moved elsewhere. Their names remain in old texts, but their function faded. Libraries store the tablets. Museums display them behind glass. Visitors read short descriptions. They moved on. The Anunnaki no longer governed daily life. They no longer explained routine events. They became historical. Quietly, the original stories were never meant to last forever. They were practical tools for a specific time and place. Once that time passed, the tools rested. There is no final message from the Anunnaki, no concluding lesson, no warning. They end not with noise, but with absence. And absence can be restful. The tablets remain still. The names remain written. Nothing more is required of them. And as this story comes to its own quiet end, there is no need to remember every detail. The purpose has already been served. Understanding has slowed. Attention can fade. And rest can begin.